So BEP is simple to define, but the question is if it is actually useful primitive for writing reliable distributed applications. And based on what we have discussed at the beginning of this lecture, you may have guessed the answer that is probably not sufficient. Okay? So to recap, BEP gives no guarantees if the message sender crashes. Right? So in this case, we would intuitively like to have something better. So what that could be? So the first abstraction, which is stronger in terms of reliability than just BEP, we're going to consider is called reliable broadcast. And reliable broadcast is the same as BEP, plus we also have an extra property that actually makes it more reliable, that guarantees all or none delivery for correct processes if the sender crashes. So let's see what it is exactly. So first off, the interface supported by regular reliable broadcast, or RB, is exactly the same as that supported by BEP. So we have request events of the form broadcast to broadcast a message, and we have indication events of the form deliver message from the source, from the sender, and then we have these four properties RB1 to RB4. So let's see what these properties are. So the first property is called validity, and it requires that if a correct process broadcasts a message, then the sender itself, so the process P, eventually delivers this message. So this property may look a bit strange to you at the first glance, but let's proceed a little bit, and then that would become more clear. Okay, the motivation for this property will become clearer. So the next property is no duplication, and that's exactly the same property as the respective property of BEP. The third property is no creation. Again, it is the same as the respective property of best effort broadcast. And finally, the fourth property is the most interesting one, and it is called agreement. Okay, and it says that if a message M is delivered by some correct process, then M is eventually delivered by every correct process. Okay, so notice that this is stronger than what we have with BEP. So with BEP, if the sender is not correct, if sender crashes, and a message is delivered by some correct process, then it is not guaranteed that it will be delivered by all correct processes. So in this case, the situation is different. So regardless of whether the sender crashed or not, it is sufficient that message is delivered by some correct process, and that for that message to be delivered by every correct process. Okay, so this is a crucial difference. So it has to do with this all or nothing requirement that we discussed before. Okay, so let's briefly discuss the meaning of this validity property. So why we need this property. So actually, the validity property together with the agreement property imply the validity property of best effort broadcast. And why is that? This is because if a correct process broadcasts M, and M is delivered by the process itself, by this property, then it is also delivered by all correct processes by the agreement property. And what we get is that this is exactly what is required by the validity of best effort broadcast. Basically, if a process is correct and broadcasts a message, then all correct processes deliver this message. Okay, So basically that means that RB, reliable broadcast, is actually a strictly stronger primitive than best effort broadcast, because it in particular implies all properties of best effort broadcast. So it implies, clearly implies no duplication and no creation, but it also implies validity because of this remark here. Okay, and in addition to that, it of course requires agreement, which is not required by best effort broadcast. Okay, so you can see that this is basically a generalization or strengthening, if you want, of best effort broadcast. Okay, so let's see a few examples to clarify the specification of reliable broadcast. So in this example, process P1 broadcasts a message M and then crashes, and message M is not delivered to any process P2, P3 or P4. And the question is if this is allowed by the specification of the reliable broadcast. So let's think 1 second, and the answer is yes, this is allowed, and this is because reliable broadcast only has any requirements with respect to message reliability if it's either its sender is correct, which is not the case here, or the message is delivered by some correct process. And in this case, this message is not delivered by any of the correct processes. And therefore, the specification of RB does not require anything in terms of delivery, in terms of the reliability of M in this case. All right, so let's see another example. So in this example, again, process P1 broadcasts a message M and then crashes. But in this case, P4, which also crashes later on, delivers the message before it crashed. And the question is if this is allowed by the RB specification. Again, let's think about it for a moment. And the answer is yes, again. And the reason is that the only process that delivers M is actually not correct. It crashes. And in this case, the agreement property of RB doesn't require that this message actually reaches any other correct processes. Also, the sender of M crashed, which also means that the message is allowed to not propagate to anyone. Okay, so again, this behavior is okay. So let's consider the following example. So here, again, we have that P1 crashes, and the message M is delivered by P3, by P4. P4 also crashes, but P3 is correct and it delivers M, and P2 is also correct, but it does not deliver M. So the question is if this behavior is allowed by the specification. And the answer is no. This is not allowed because P3 is a correct process and it delivers M. So in this case, the agreement, the RB4 agreement property of reliable broadcast actually dictates that M must also be delivered by P2, which is a correct process, but it is not delivered. Okay, so in this example is absolutely fine from the perspective of best effort broadcast, but it is not acceptable for the reliable broadcast because it violates the agreement property. Okay, so here you can see the difference between best effort broadcast and reliable broadcast on a specific example. Okay. So here's another example. So in this example, we actually have the sender of a process being correct. So in the previous three examples, we have the sender being crushed, and here it is correct. Okay, so P1 is correct, sends message, and then it is delivered by process P4, which later crashes, and it is not delivered by any of P1, P2, and P3. And the question is if this is a correct behavior. Let's pause this and think about it. And the answer is that it is, of course, incorrect. And this is because a message which is broadcast by a correct process, and P1 is correct in this case, must be delivered by P1, and it is not delivered by P1. And once it's delivered by P1, by the agreement, it must also be delivered by all other correct processes, P2 and P3. So the correct behavior in this case is for M to be delivered by all three of them, by P1, P2, and P3. But it is not delivered by these processes, it's actually delivered by process which later crashes. So this behavior is incorrect. It is not allowed by the specification of reliable broadcast. So here's another example. So here we have again P1 is a correct sender, and the message it sends, message M, is delivered by P1, P2, and P4, and all three of them, P1, P2, and P4, are correct, and P3 actually crashes before it delivers message M. So is this behavior correct? And the answer is yes. This behavior is allowed by the specification because in this case we see that the message that was broadcast by a correct process is delivered by all correct processes, and that is of course required by the RB specification.